Hello, my name is Gabriel, 35 years old, a technology engineer working for Nexlify, a billion-dollar tech corporation headquartered in Silicon Valley, South San Francisco Bay. I've been with this company since its early days as a tiny startup. I still remember the day I first stepped into Nexlify's office 10 years ago. The space was cramped, filled with the smell of burnt coffee and the incessant clacking of keyboards. Back then, I, Gabriel, was just a 25-year-old software engineer, full of passion, but equipped with nothing more than an old laptop and big dreams. Today, after nearly a decade of dedication to the company, I have my own spacious, well-furnished office and a six-figure annual income. 10 years ago, I was the one who wrote the first lines of code for Nexlify's core data management and operations system. It wasn't just a system, it was the heart of the company. I spent months pulling all-nighters, typing line after line of code, debugging every minor error to create something that could save the company millions in operational costs. When that system went live, I remember the gleam in Richard's eyes, Nexlify's CEO, as he stood before the team and declared, "Gabriel is our genius mind. He's changed the game." Those words to me were more than just recognition. They were motivation, the spark that drove me to give my all. In the early years, I basked in my own glory. Nexlify grew from a small startup into a tech giant, and my system was the foundation of that growth. Every time the company scaled up, I found ways to optimize and upgrade, ensuring everything ran smoothly. I wasn't just an engineer. I was the one keeping this massive machine in motion. Colleagues looked at me with admiration, and Richard frequently mentioned my name in interviews. "Gabriel is Nexlify's most valuable asset," he once said in a major tech magazine. I believed it, truly. But the glory, it turns out, didn't last forever. I'm not sure exactly when things started to change. Perhaps 3 years ago, when Nexlify had become a billion-dollar company with thousands of employees and offices spanning the globe. I was still working hard, still optimizing the system, still ensuring no glitch could halt this colossal machine. But Richard's gaze toward me wasn't the same anymore. The praise faded, replaced by a cold silence. In meetings, he began dismissing my input, sometimes cutting me off with a casual remark. "Thanks, Gabriel, but we need fresh ideas." Fresh ideas? I had built an entire system from scratch, and now he was saying I lacked fresh ideas? I tried not to dwell on it. I told myself my work was still vital, that the system I built remained the backbone of the company. But the truth is, every time I stepped into the office, I felt an invisible distance. Colleagues who once patted me on the back or invited me for coffee to discuss technical matters now kept their distance. They didn't say it outright, but I knew they sensed the shift in how Richard treated me. And that made me feel like an outsider. One afternoon, I was in a meeting room preparing to present a new system upgrade. I had spent months ensuring it could handle double the data load for the coming year. But as I began speaking, Richard interrupted. "Gabriel, I don't think you need to go into detail. Your system is fine. Let it run. We need to focus on more groundbreaking projects." The room fell silent. My face burned, not with anger, but with embarrassment. I had poured my heart into that upgrade, but to Richard it was worthless. From then on, I was excluded from strategic meetings. New projects, big ideas, they were all handed to fresh faces, young engineers newly hired. I didn't envy them, they were talented, and I knew it. But what broke my heart was how Richard took my contributions for granted, as if the system I built would run forever without needing me. He once called me a genius mind. But now, in his eyes, I was just a maintenance worker, an outdated machine with no value. I tried to stay calm. I told myself that as long as I did my job well, everything would be fine. But the truth is, every day at work felt like stepping into an invisible arena where I had to prove my worth again, even though no one cared to acknowledge it. My salary was still high, commensurate with my experience and role, but Richard began to complain. In a private meeting, he looked me in the eye and said, "Gabriel, you're paid so well, but I haven't seen any groundbreaking contributions from you in years." Those words cut like a knife. I wanted to scream, to recount the sleepless nights fixing bugs, the times I saved the system from crashing. But I just nodded silently and left the room. The sense of isolation grew. Colleagues started looking at me differently. Some even avoided me as if Richard's coldness might rub off on them. I began to question myself. What did I do wrong? Am I really no longer valuable? But then, every time I looked at the system I built, saw it running smoothly, I reassured myself, no, I'm not useless. I laid the foundation for all of this. But Richard didn't see it that way. He once called me a valuable asset, but now he looked at me like a thorn in his side. Once when I bumped into him in the hallway, he didn't even glance at me. Just a dismissive look, then he walked past as if I were an invisible employee. I stood there in the crowded hallway, feeling my heart constrict. I had given 10 years of my life to Nexlify, but now I was just a nobody. I started wondering if I should leave. But leave for what? I loved this job, loved the system I built, loved what Nexlify once stood for. And a part of me naively still hoped that Richard would change, that he'd remember the early days when we built this dream together. I was wrong. The final straw came at Nexlify's year-end party held at a luxurious hotel in San Francisco. I had been looking forward to that event, not for the glamour, but for a chance to feel a bit of the camaraderie from the early days. I put on a new suit, looked in the mirror, and told myself, "You're still Gabriel. You're still valuable." I drove my BMW to the party, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The banquet hall that evening was aglow with the shimmer of chandeliers, soft jazz music playing gently in the background, the clinking of wine glasses mingling with the hearty laughter of colleagues, creating an atmosphere that was both lively and warm. Everything seemed perfect until I discovered my assigned seat. I was placed at the farthest table near the area for trash and leftover food, right by the server's walkway. I tried not to let it bother me, but as I looked around and saw other colleagues, even new hires, seated at more prominent, dignified spots, a sharp pang stabbed through my chest. This was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated humiliation. I sat alone in the corner of the hall, waiting for the rest of the guests to arrive. No one paid me any attention. I sat there, quietly observing the stream of people entering. Familiar faces of colleagues, managers, and important guests. After a while, a few others joined my table. Not peers or managers, but the janitors and security guards I often greeted daily. I respected and appreciated them, but I couldn't help feeling a bitter sting. Why had the boss placed me at their table? The sense of being pushed to the sidelines, of being silently humiliated, simmered in my chest. The party began once all the guests had arrived. Hotel staff started bringing out steaming, appetizing dishes. The tables around me were served with lavish delicacies, lobster, salmon, and premium red wine. My table was different. We got a few mediocre dishes, cold cuts, salad, and a plate of congealed steak, clearly forgotten for hours. The atmosphere around me grew stifling, almost suffocating. Everything felt constricted. I sat there, clutching my wine glass tightly, forcing a strained smile. Every glance that swept past, every fleeting look from colleagues felt like a knife slicing into my pride. They knew. They saw me being pushed aside, and the worst part was no one dared to speak up. I tried to focus on the food in front of me, but my mind couldn't escape this wretched table. I glanced at the other tables where young engineers' new faces were laughing and chatting animatedly with senior managers. Ethan, the guy Richard called the future of Nexlify, sat at the main table right next to Richard, his eyes gleaming as Richard patted his shoulder with pride. I didn't envy Ethan. He was talented, and I acknowledged that. But this injustice, the way Richard deliberately diminished me, burned like a smoldering fire in my chest. I took a sip of wine, trying to quell the feeling, but then Richard stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, his voice ringing out with confidence and enthusiasm. "Welcome, everyone, to Nexlify's year-end gala," he began, his eyes scanning the hall but seeming to deliberately avoid my corner. He spoke of the company's achievements, record-breaking revenue, and major contracts with international corporations. I waited, clinging to a faint hope that he might mention the system I built, the foundation that enabled those numbers he boasted about. But nothing. Not a single word. Instead, Richard devoted much of his speech to praising Ethan. "We're lucky to have young talents like Ethan," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "He's proof of Nexlify's future, the one who will take us to new heights." The hall erupted in applause. I looked at Ethan, saw him bow his head with a shy but proud smile. I didn't blame him. But each of Richard's praises felt like a hammer striking my self-esteem. 10 years of dedication, 10 years of sweat and heart erased in a few minutes of speech. I stared down at my wine glass, my heart pounding. A voice in my head whispered, "You don't belong here anymore, Gabriel." But I tried to push it away. I had given my youth to Nexlify. I had written every line of code, fixed every bug, stayed up countless nights to keep this machine running. I couldn't let Richard or anyone make me feel worthless. But then things got worse. As Richard finished his speech and returned to the main table, an old colleague, Sarah, who had worked with me in the early days, approached. She smiled, but her eyes betrayed pity. "Gabriel, it's been a while," she said softly. "Are you okay?" I knew she wasn't just asking about my health. She saw how I was being treated, saw this miserable table, saw Richard's coldness. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Sarah, thanks." But as she walked away, a wave of emotion surged within me, a mix of anger, shame, and an indescribable pain. I stood up, intending to leave the hall for some fresh air. But at that moment, Richard passed by, wineglass in hand, chatting jovially with a group of managers. He saw me, and instead of brushing past as usual, he stopped. His eyes glinted with a hint of disdain, as if I were something that irritated him. "Gabriel," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Enjoying the party? I hope you're having fun, because you deserve to relax a bit after all these years of maintaining the system." He emphasized maintaining, as if to remind me that in his eyes I was no longer the genius mind. I stood there, feeling the blood rush to my head. The entire hall seemed to blur, leaving just me and Richard standing face to face amidst curious glances from colleagues. I wanted to stay silent, as I had so many times before. I wanted to swallow this insult, as I had for the past 3 years, but this time something in me snapped. "Mr. Richard," I said, my voice calm but firm, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm not sure if I'm enjoying the party, but I know I've spent 10 years building the system that Nexlify stands on. The system you once called the heart of the company. The system that saved us millions, enabled us to scale, and achieve the numbers you just boasted about on stage. So if you think I'm just maintaining, maybe you should take a look at what this company has accomplished because of me." The hall fell deathly silent. Eyes turned toward me, some shocked, some curious, some wary. My heart pounded, but I didn't stop. I had been silent for too long. "I'm not asking for your gratitude," I continued, my voice slightly trembling but resolute. "But I think I deserve respect at the very least, not to be shoved into a corner table near the trash at a party I helped make possible." Richard looked at me, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling into a cold smile. He took a sip of wine and responded, his voice even but sharp as a blade. "Gabriel, if you're unhappy, you're free to leave. The door is always open. We don't need people who only live in the past." Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. Not because they were unexpected, I had seen his attitude for years, but because they were said in front of the entire company. In front of colleagues, friends, people who once looked at me with admiration. I stood there, feeling the world crumble around me. But instead of collapsing with it, something inside me burned brighter than ever. I looked straight into Richard's eyes, unflinching. "Thank you for the reminder," I said, my voice low but resolute. "Maybe I should indeed reconsider where I belong." I turned and walked out of the hall, leaving behind the stares and whispers. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I could no longer live in the shadow of my own contributions. As I stepped outside, the cold San Francisco air hit my face. I stood under a street lamp, my breath forming white clouds in the winter night. I felt both relieved and terrified. Relieved because I had finally voiced the weight in my heart. Terrified because I had just confronted one of Nexlify's most powerful men. And perhaps I had just ended my 10-year career. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. I wouldn't let Richard or anyone define my worth. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I sat at my desk and began drafting my resignation letter. I decided to write the letter by hand. I wanted each stroke of the pen to be a declaration, a definitive end to a decade of underappreciated dedication. Every time the pen touched the paper, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. Dear Mr. Richard and Nexlify's leadership team, I wrote, my handwriting firm but betraying a slight tremble. I recounted my journey, the early days when I wrote the first lines of code for the core system, the sleepless nights fixing bugs, the times I kept this colossal machine from collapsing. But I wasn't begging for recognition. I'm leaving because I believe my talent and dedication deserve to be valued, I wrote, and I will find a place where that becomes a reality. As I signed my name, Gabriel, at the bottom of the letter, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't fear, but liberation. I carefully folded the paper and slipped it into a white envelope. The dim light in my apartment cast a soft glow on the envelope, making it look like a small object carrying the weight of an entire decade. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. I could no longer let Richard or anyone define my worth. The next morning, I arrived at Nexlify's office earlier than usual. The hallways were still gleaming and bustling as always, but to me everything felt different. I no longer belonged here. All morning I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the moment to face Richard. Around 10 a.m., I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor where Richard's office was located. I paused in front of the familiar door, took a deep breath, and knocked. From inside, his voice came low and cold. Come in. I opened the door and stepped inside. Richard was seated behind his desk, his eyes flicking over me with indifference. He wore an expensive suit, his hair impeccably styled, as if nothing had happened the previous night. I walked forward and placed the envelope on his desk. This is my resignation letter, I said, my voice calm but resolute. He raised an eyebrow, picked up the envelope, and skimmed the letter. A smirk crept across his lips. A handwritten letter, Gabriel. You're quite the sentimentalist, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He folded the paper and tossed it back onto the desk as if it were worthless. Do you think quitting will make you a hero? Or that this company will collapse without you? He let out a sharp, cold laugh that made me clench my fists in my pockets. I don't think anything, I replied, meeting his gaze head-on. I just know I can't stay in a place where a decade of dedication is treated like a joke. Richard leaned forward, his eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. You know, Gabriel, I'm glad you're leaving on your own. We don't need people like you, clinging to the past with nothing new to offer. Ethan will outshine you 100 times over. He stood, walked around the desk, and faced me. Go ahead and leave. You'll soon realize you're nothing without Nexlify. The door's always open, but not for you to come back. His words cut like a knife, but I refused to let myself falter. I looked at him, unwavering. Thank you for the advice, I said, my voice low but resolute. But I don't need Nexlify to prove my worth. I turned and walked out, leaving Richard with his smug smile. I heard him call after me. Good luck, Gabriel. You'll need it? But I didn't stop. As I left his office, my heart pounded. Part of me wanted to turn back, to shout that he'd regret this, but I didn't. I knew words wouldn't be enough. Actions would be my answer. I returned to my office and began packing my personal belongings. A few programming books, an old coffee mug, and a photo of the original Nexlify team. I looked at my smile in that picture, wondering where that passionate young man had gone. As I packed, Sarah appeared at the door. Gabriel, I heard you submitted your resignation, she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you sure? I know last night things weren't great, but you're the soul of this company." I smiled, but it was a bitter smile. "Thanks, Sarah, but I can't stay where I'm not needed." She looked at me, wanting to say more, but only nodded. "You're stronger than I thought," she said before leaving. Those simple words brought me a sense of relief. At least someone still understood me. News of my resignation spread quickly. A few colleagues stopped by asking questions with a mix of curiosity and pity. I overheard from an assistant that Richard was mocking me in a meeting, telling the management team, "Gabriel thinks he's irreplaceable? Let him go. We have Ethan and the system will run fine without him." Those words stung, but they also solidified my decision. Richard thought I was a replaceable cog. He'd soon see I was the one keeping the machine running. I left the office with a small box of personal items. I didn't look back. As I rode the elevator down, I overheard a group of young engineers whispering, "Gabriel's really leaving. Who's going to handle the system if something goes wrong?" one said. "Ethan's got it, right?" another replied, but their voice was tinged with doubt. I gave a faint smile. They didn't know that the system I built wasn't just code. It was my experience, my deep understanding of every tiny detail. Ethan was talented, but he hadn't faced the storms I'd weathered. As I stepped out of the building, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Will you be okay? Call me if you need anything." I replied briefly, "I'll be fine, thanks." But truthfully, I wasn't sure if I'd be okay. I'd just walked away from a stable job, a high salary, and a position any Silicon Valley engineer would dream of. I stood before an uncertain future with no concrete plans, no job offers elsewhere. Only a fierce belief that I couldn't let Richard define my worth. That night, I sat in my apartment scrolling through my LinkedIn contacts. My name, Gabriel, had once carried weight in the tech industry. My achievements at Nexlify weren't a secret. The articles, the conferences, Richard's old praises were still out there, indelible marks. I sent emails to a few old connections, not to beg for a job. I didn't want to seem desperate, but to test the waters, to see if the world still remembered me. Just a few hours later, an email arrived from TechTrend, a major competitor of Nexlify. The sender was Linda, the HR director I'd met at a tech conference. "Gabriel, I just heard you left Nexlify," the email read. "We're looking for a technical director to lead a strategic project. With your experience and reputation, I believe you're the perfect fit. Do you have time to talk?" I read the email over and over, a spark of light piercing the darkness. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to prove Richard wrong. I replied immediately, scheduling a meeting for the following week. As I closed my laptop, my heart raced, not with fear, but with excitement. I had crossed a line and there was no going back. Richard thought I was just a maintenance worker, someone living in the past. He'd soon see that I didn't just build a system, I built a future. And that future I would hold in my own hands. On Monday morning, just 4 days after I responded to Linda's email, TechTrend's HR director, I found myself sitting across from her in an upscale cafe in the heart of the city. "Gabriel, we've been watching you for a long time," Linda said, her eyes sincere. "The system you built for Nexlify is a feat. We need someone like you to lead our new project, a groundbreaking AI platform that could transform how the tech industry operates." I listened, my heart pounding. It wasn't just the salary they offered, 30% higher than Nexlify's, but the way they spoke about me. They didn't see me as a maintenance worker or someone clinging to the past. They saw me as a pioneer. I accepted the offer without hesitation. A week later, I started at TechTrend. On my first day, I immediately felt the difference. Colleagues welcomed me with respect, not because I was a new hire, but because they knew what I had accomplished. The AI platform TechTrend entrusted me with was brimming with potential, but also fraught with challenges. It was like a colossal machine, more complex than the system I had built at Nexlify. But that complexity thrilled me. I dove into the work, analyzing data day and night, optimizing algorithms, and leading the team. Every line of code I wrote, every decision I made was a reminder. I wasn't just a maintenance engineer living off past glories. I was Gabriel, someone capable of reshaping the tech industry. Within 3 months, our project began showing results. TechTrend's AI platform didn't just run smoothly, it exceeded expectations. We reduced data processing time by 40% compared to competitors, and major clients, from financial firms to retail giants, started flocking to sign contracts. A TechCrunch article called me the mastermind behind TechTrend's AI revolution. My name began appearing in conferences, interviews, and industry whispers. Gabriel did what Nextlify never could, one journalist wrote. Reading those words, for the first time in years, I felt my self-respect being restored. But while I was building a future at TechTrend, Nextlify was falling apart. I didn't actively follow their downfall. I didn't need to. News reached me through emails from former colleagues, LinkedIn posts, and industry gossip. The system I had built, the heart of Nextlify, started malfunctioning. Not minor glitches, but serious issues. Delayed data, interrupted transactions, and major clients complaining about performance. Ethan, the young engineer Richard had pinned his hopes on, couldn't handle it. He was talented, but he lacked the 10 years of experience I had, the deep understanding of the system I had spent a decade perfecting. Sarah, my old colleague, sent me a message late one night. "Gabriel, things here are a mess. The system keeps crashing and Ethan doesn't know what to do. Richard's losing it, but he won't admit he was wrong." I read the message, feeling a pang of sympathy but no surprise. I had warned Richard, not with words but with my departure. He thought the system would run forever without me? He was wrong. A few days later, I got a call from a former Nextlify client now working with TechTrend. "Gabriel, have you heard about Nextlify?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "They just lost a major contract with us because their system keeps crashing. Clients are leaving in droves." I didn't say much, just nodded over the phone. But inside, a wave surged. Not joy, but validation. I had been right to leave. I had been right to believe in my worth. Nextlify's revenue began to plummet. Articles started appearing, criticizing Richard's poor leadership. Meanwhile, at TechTrend, I kept pushing forward. Our AI project wasn't just succeeding domestically, it was gaining international attention. A major European conglomerate invited me to speak at a tech conference in London. Standing on that stage before hundreds of investors and experts, I shared my journey, not as a victim of Nextlify, but as someone who had risen from the shadows to build something greater. "Every line of code tells a story," I said, "and I chose to write mine where it's valued." The auditorium erupted in applause. At that moment, I knew I wasn't just an engineer, I was a symbol of resilience. But deep down, I couldn't completely forget Nextlify. Not because I wanted to go back, never, but because I remembered the early days when we were a small team dreaming of something grand. I remembered Richard, who once called me a genius mind before his arrogance clouded everything. Part of me wanted him to see me now, to realize he had misjudged me. But I knew, whether he saw it or not, I had proven it, not to him, but to myself. One morning while working in my TechTrend office, Sarah called. "Gabriel, I don't know how to say this," she said, her voice trembling. "Nextlify is spiraling. Richard just laid off a bunch of people to cut costs, but no one dares speak up. I think I want to leave too." "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "if you want, send me your resume. TechTrend could always use someone as talented as you." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Thanks, Gabriel. I'll think about it." 6 months had passed since I left Nextlify, and each day at TechTrend I felt a renewed vitality, not just in my work, but in who I was as a person. TechTrend was rising rapidly, and I, Gabriel, was at the helm. Yet deep down, I couldn't deny one truth. Every success I achieved here was a reminder of what Nextlify had lost. One evening, while checking my emails, I received a message from Sarah. "Gabriel, I can't take it anymore," she wrote. "Richard is turning Nextlify into a nightmare. I want out. Can you help me? I smiled and replied, send me your resume. TechTrend is always open to someone like you. Sarah wasn't the only one. In the weeks that followed, I received emails and calls from other former colleagues, talented engineers who had been the backbone of Nexlify but now felt undervalued and abandoned. There was Mark, who had designed the interface for my system. Lisa, a data analyst with an unmatched knack for spotting errors. And David, a seasoned programmer who had worked alongside me in the early days. They all shared the same sentiment: frustration with Richard's management, his misplaced faith in inexperienced newcomers, and the suffocating atmosphere at Nexlify. I didn't recruit them, I simply opened a door. If you want change, TechTrend is ready, I told them during an informal meetup at a cafe. I shared details about our AI project, how we were reshaping the tech industry, and the kind of environment where every idea was heard. They looked at me, their eyes lighting up, not just because of the opportunity, but because they saw in me the Gabriel they once admired, now reclaiming his brilliance. Within 2 months, Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and David joined TechTrend. They brought their expertise, dedication, and a touch of resentment from their time at Nexlify. Together, we formed a formidable team. TechTrend's AI system didn't just improve in performance, it expanded into new domains, from financial transaction processing to medical data analysis. Major contracts poured in, and TechTrend's name began to outshine Nexlify on tech industry rankings. A Wired article dubbed us Silicon Valley's new wind of change. A year passed in a blink, and I found myself sitting in a TechTrend meeting room, now one of Silicon Valley's top tech companies. The table before me was covered with documents for a new project, and my team, Sarah, Mark, Lisa, David, and others, was buzzing with ideas about expanding into the Asian market. We hadn't just surpassed Nexlify in market share, we had become a symbol of innovation. But even in that glow, I never expected fate to bring me face to face with my past. One morning, Linda, the HR director, stepped into my office with an unusual expression. "Gabriel, do you have time to review a job application?" she asked. "It's a rather special candidate." I nodded and took the file. When I opened it, I froze. The name at the top, Richard Coleman. Richard, my former boss, the man who had called me a relic of the past, was now applying for a job at TechTrend, the company I was leading. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to laugh, to call him in immediately and ask, "Do you think you're worthy of working here?" But I held back. I had moved beyond those days of anger. Instead, I told Linda to schedule an interview. I want to meet him in person. News about Nexlify reached me before the interview. The board had fired Richard after a series of devastating losses. The system's collapse, the departure of key personnel, and the withdrawal of major contracts had pushed the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Richard's reputation, once that of a star CEO, was now in tatters. Articles branded him the man who lost Nexlify to his own arrogance. Reading those words, I didn't feel glee, only a twinge of pity. He had once inspired me, but he had chosen this path himself. On the day of the interview, Richard walked into the meeting room. He was a far cry from the confident, arrogant man I once knew. His hair was grayer, his face gaunt, and his eyes no longer carried that dismissive glint. Instead, they held tension, almost desperation. I sat across from him, composed, but inside a storm of emotions churned. "Hello, Richard," I said evenly. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, forcing a smile. "Gabriel, I didn't expect you to be the one interviewing me," he said, his voice slightly shaky. I didn't respond, just opened his file and began asking questions. Sharp, professional ones about team management, crisis handling, and building company culture. With each question, I saw him falter, struggling to answer while unable to hide his lack of confidence. "Do you believe a leader should value those who have dedicated themselves to the company?" I asked, my eyes locked on his. Richard hesitated, then said, "Of course, I've always tried to do that." I gave a faint smile. "Have you? Then why did Nexlify lose its best talent?" The question hung in the air. Richard looked down, silent, He didn't need to answer. He knew where the truth lay. I didn't reject him outright. I didn't need to. I simply said, "We'll review your application and get back to you." Richard nodded, stood, and left the room. As the door closed, I felt an odd sense of peace. I didn't need harsh words to exact revenge. My success at TechTrend, the team I had built, and Nexlify's collapse were proof enough. Talent and respect, those were what defined me. And Richard now was merely a shadow of the past.